So what we have to grasp here, really essentially, are a couple of main points. First, that what he's saying about grief, which is, of course, he recognizes to be a normal human feeling and experience, is that grief is inherently irrational. Other emotions can be irrational in certain circumstances, but grief is always irrational. We need to talk about that. That's really the most interesting, I think. It's the reason I gave it to you to read. That's the most interesting part of it. And secondly, in order to defend that idea and to differentiate grief from the more general emotion of sorrow, there's a specific point, and that is that a desire is something different than a wish. If there isn't that distinction, if a desire is not different from a wish, if that's not a meaningful distinction, then the whole thing falls apart. So we have to hit on those two things. So to go back to the essential thing here, very, very important, of course, is the definition of grief that he gives on pages 465 and 466, I guess. No, I'm sorry. That's earlier. It's 463, 464. But if we look, yeah, see, okay, talking about the rationality of grief. Now, at the bottom of page 465, he says that grief can be less than fully rational, that is, in some degree irrational, along three dimensions. It is not unlike many emotions in this respect. However, unlike some other emotions, grief is irremediably, I have real trouble with that word, irremediably less than fully rational along one of these dimensions, according to G. You see, there's two senses that he explains there on page 466. The first two senses in which grief can be irrational is ways that other emotions can be irrational. The first way could be if the belief upon which the emotion is founded is an irrational belief. In that case, you know, really like phobias, you know, is really what he's talking about. If you have the feeling of fear every time you pass a mailbox, okay, that, you know, that's an irrational fear because mailboxes can't do you any harm, you know? So grief can be irrational in that way too. That is, if you're grieving over someone's death and they're obviously alive, then your grief is irrational. And then in the middle of 466, he says, secondly, emotions can be irrational in their feeling or affective aspects or dimensions. For instance, it can be irrational to grieve to the degree one does, with the depth, the extent, or with the longevity of the feelings constitutive of grief. Now that's a more contentious point, because what he basically is saying there is that we can grieve too much or we can grieve too long, and that is something we'll discuss, and that is something, for instance, that will come up when we read C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, is that, you know, how is it irrational to grieve forever? Is it irrational to grieve so much that over someone's death that your life loses all meaning, things like that? That's more contentious. But his most important point is the third point, the bottom of page 466. He says, thirdly, emotions may be less than fully rational in the dimension of their ingredient desires. According to theory G, which is, again, his definition of grief, grief is irrational in this respect. For instance, G is satisfied as follows. S grieves N's death. S knows and believes that N is dead. S has feelings of loss, pain, anger, and the like at the loss of N. And, importantly, S desires that it not be the case that N is dead. In suitable circumstances, these conditions are sufficient for S's grief at the death of N. Note that S's belief and S's desire are incompatible. That's the very crux of the matter here. That is, a belief and a desire had by an agent at a given time are incompatible in this way in case the desire is unsatisfiable on the truth of the belief. That is, if you're in this state, if your desire cannot be satisfied if your belief is true. And that's the case of true grief. That is, if your belief that the person is dead is true, and your desire is that they not be dead, that they be alive, then your desire is unsatisfiable if your belief is true. Since, to continue, in the present instancing of G, S's belief is true, by hypothesis N has died, S's desire is unsatisfiable. In whatever sense of necessary it is true that the dead cannot also be alive, that is, not dead. In that sense, S's desire is necessarily unsatisfiable. Since S's belief that N is dead is true and reasonably held, S understands this very necessity, again by hypothesis. That is, you know, it's not just that you want them to be alive and they can't be alive. It's that you want them to be alive, they can't be alive, and you know that they can't be alive. Right? You're not thinking they could possibly be alive. Your belief has to be that they cannot be alive, yet you still desire them to be alive. Thus, S's desire is inherently irrational. Irrational in the sense of just thinking about a human being and within your mind. Irrational in the sense of logically incompatible. You can't believe that S is true and S is false at the same time. That's irrational, right? To have two contradictory beliefs. In this case, the contradiction is not between two beliefs, it's between a belief and a desire. Thus, S's desire is inherently irrational, not just sometimes. What he's saying is grief is always irrational. That's why it hurts so bad, right? In that it is recognizably unsatisfiable and necessarily so on S's own understanding of it. G then implies that the emotion of grief is, in just this way, inherently less than rational in its desire dimension. So that's really the most important point. We're going to have to do one more essay, one more video, just to clear up the essential point of the difference between a wish and a desire. But this is the essence of it. I mean, hopefully you get to video 3, because this is the most important part of it, this notion that grief is inherently, essentially, always an irrational state because of the incompatibility between what we believe and what we want or desire.